Welcome to Tiny Expeditions. This is Season 5, Episode 3. This season we are getting pop cultured and we've been talking about mutants. We've been talking about superpowers and having a great time doing that. My name is Chris and I'm going to be your story guide yet again today.
And I'm Dr. Sarah Sharman, here to help you understand the science.
And we have a very special guest with us in our studio today. Lindsay is joining us. Lindsay is our summer intern here at the Institute. Lindsay, you want to say hi?
Hi, everyone.
Excellent. Sarah, we've had some time to talk about this, right? About our favorite superheroes, favorite mutants. Lindsay, do you have any superheroes or mutants that you really gravitate towards?
Yes, my favorite superhero would have to be Vision from the Marvel Comics universe. I just really love Vision. Just such a great character, but also Iron Man,
Okay.
Long live Iron Man.
So just to help us out, Vision, the superpower involved here is what?
I think he does like a plethora of things. I'm not really sure what stone he came from, but he is part of one of the Infinity Stones that Thanos is trying to capture. So.
Okay, and how long have you spent thinking about the plausibility of these powers existing in the real world?
Truthfully, maybe like 5 minutes, because I don't really think they would ever happen.
Okay, well, good. That's why you're here on this episode. That's what we're talking about. I got to kind of have fun last episode because we talked about Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, who are, I guess I could say, my favorite superheroes or favorite mutants.
Actually, Chris, if the Turtles were in the Marvel universe, they wouldn't technically be considered mutants.
Okay, so you're going to need to explain this out a little bit more.
So in the X-Men storyline, at least, there are two groups of people who have powers. One group of them are called mutants, and they are born with an activated X gene.
Okay.
And then the other ones are called mutates, and they gain their ability through environmental exposures, kind of like how the Turtles were exposed to the glowing ooze.
So you're telling me there's a difference between a mutant and a mutate?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. No matter how you define it, can we at least still acknowledge that the Turtles are pretty stinking cool because they love pizza, are ninjas, and they fight bad guys?
Yeah, I mean, we're not arguing they're not cool, but I think we played that out in the last episode, so maybe let's move along to some new superheroes.
All right, you're right. And so for this episode, to help us move that along, we're going to talk to a faculty investigator here at the HudsonAlpha Institute.
That's right. We sat down with Dr. Greg Cooper. He and his lab use genetic and genomic technologies to help diagnose children with rare neurodevelopmental disorders.
We heard that you were a big sci-fi fan. Is that
That's correct, yes. Yep.
I myself am I don't think this would be sci-fi per se, but we talked about Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles.
Okay, sure.
That's my favorite. I don't think that's exactly down your alley, but what is down your alley? Do you have a favorite superhero or superhuman character that you connect with?
I tend to be more science fiction in the sense of like the culture novels and Three Body Problem, that sort of thing. But I also certainly enjoy comic book and superhero style stories. I guess I like the stories that sort of give you a glimpse into more honest humanity in some sense, right? One example I thought of was a character like Daredevil, which is really about turning a disadvantage to an advantage, a weakness into a strength. And to me, that's sort of a genuine human superpower, if you will, is that sort of resilience and adaptability and creativity to overcome a problem when you're faced with it and come out the stronger for it. And so, another example I think would be like Iron Man is always a fun story because that's fundamentally about, there's no magic elixir or spider bite there. That's really about somebody being put into a difficult circumstance and kind of inventing their way out of it using their creativity and drive to emerge better. So those are the kind of stories that I like.
A lot of times in these movies, especially like X-Men, there's like allegedly the one X gene that these superheroes have, but then they all have a different range of a power that comes from that one gene. Is it possible that a single mutation could cause this many different traits?
I think there's multiple layers to this question. The first is this notion of a gene versus a mutation or a variant, right? So you might hear in the news about a story that says, well, they've discovered the gene for whatever, schizophrenia or diabetes or whatever, and that's really never the right way to think about it. It's not a gene for a thing. Is everybody, each one of us has tens of thousands of genes, and what makes us different are that we sometimes have variation in those genes. So it's not that you have a gene and I don't, it's that we have different flavors of that gene. And so are different, again, this is where the word mutation and variant and allele would be a more scientific word for it, but variation of genes is different than the genes themselves. So it's not generally correct to say that this is the gene for whatever trait, right? And it's in part because there is this complicated mapping of traits to genes and genes to traits. So one gene can affect many traits. So that certainly is true that a single gene can play a role in developing your skin and developing internal organs and developing muscles and all kinds of things. And it's also true that a single trait, so like muscle mass or your skin, involves many, many genes. So there's this kind of many-to-many connection. And so I think it's important to talk about keeping that terminology sort of separate, right? The difference between a gene and a variant or a flavor of a gene. And I guess getting back to the question of can a single gene or a single variant affect many different attributes? And the answer is absolutely. A term for this would be pleiotropy, is sort of this more scientific technical term that a single genetic variant gives rise to a whole range of different traits or phenotypes or attributes. And so that is, generally speaking, it's pretty true. I will say one big difference between comic book movie reality and actual reality is that for the most part, genetic variants, if they're going to do something that has a pleiotropic effect, it's often that it does multiple bad things, unfortunately, right? So when we think about conditions that, especially when the kind of conditions that my lab studies about early onset, so young, things that arise during early childhood, a child could have a problem with both their both seizures and muscle problems or growth problems, and so that's a case where a single variant actually affects multiple different organ systems, multiple different tissues, and different cell types, and that manifests in symptoms at various parts of your body, and it's not just one thing or feature that's affected.
So in the X-Men universe, I think there are also 2 flavors of these mutants, and we talked about this a little bit with Sarah, but we wanted your take on it. So some of them get their mutation, or this X gene is activated through environmental factors, but then others are just born with it and it's already activated. I know that there's something like that in the real world at your lab studies. So do you want to talk to us a little bit about environmental versus de novo mutations?
Sure. So it again, as we talked about earlier, at the end of the day, every single one of us is a product of both nature and nurture, right? So it's very much a combination effect. And now there are certainly some features that there are things that are where your genetics are really powerful and they're present from birth, and they dictate a lot about a particular health attribute. And then there are other conditions that are essentially fully environmental, right? So whether you get infected with a virus, you have to be exposed to that virus. But then the truth is most things involve it's a spectrum, right? Of things that are fully genetic to things that are fully environmental. Most things are in between. And in fact, arguably everything is in between to some degree that, for example, when you're exposed to a virus, whether you actually get sick with it depends on your immune system, depends on your age, depends on your health status, all kinds of other things that aren't really a result of your DNA per se. It's your background and your nutrition and all kinds of different factors that play in. So our job as geneticists is to sort of tease out the genetic portion, and certainly there are lots of people that study environmental risk factors. So we know smoking, for things like smoking and diet, we can trace a lot of different health attributes to those features. But arguably, environmental effects are in many ways a lot harder than genetic effects, just because your environment is it's so variable, it's so dependent on things that haven't been observed or measured. We're not tracking. I guess with iPhones and Apple Watches, we're tracking lots of things more effectively than we ever were before. But for most of us, we don't have sort of second by second measurements of the air you're breathing or the calories you're taking in or, those sorts of things. So it's much harder to tease out a lot of environmental effects. Whereas in genetics, we have a lot of tools at our disposal that you don't have when you're trying to study environmental effects. But again, it's safe to say that that a lot of, effectively nearly everything is a function of both to some degree.
If you have a mutation that allows you to fly, right? We understand that flight happens because of, physics, pressure differentials.
Yeah.
But then you have Superman. And I'm not necessarily saying he is a mutant, right? It's a different category altogether.
Yeah.
But there's something called the laws of physics there.
Sure.
that usually prevents somebody from flying without wings.
Sure.
Right?
Yep.
Let's say someone has a mutation that gives them some sort of super ability. Is this something that the physical body would even be able to maintain and overcome the forces of physics and the laws of nature in order to, see the benefit of it?
So the short answer is it depends, but no, right? So think something like Superman, for example, if you're flying faster than the speed of sound, you have friction on your skin and it's going to burn up, right? And I'm not a physicist, but I don't think our bones and musculature and skin structure we're not built for that, right? You can imagine the space shuttle, the design of a space shuttle to get up and out of Earth's gravity into space is the physical constraints that needed to pull that off are extraordinary, and our biology is just not equipped for that. So for the most part, for a lot of those things, imagine Superman, his laser beam eyes, right? They would melt an eyeball. There's no way they could produce enough heat to do what his laser eyes do and not also melt his eyes or in his skull, right? So no, I think the answer is that there are a lot of physiological constraints. Another example would be like Aquaman. If you were to really swim down 1,000 feet below sea level underwater, the pressure down there is tremendous, right? And it's dark, you can't see anything. So you just think about all these things that comic books and stories have the ability to just sort of glide over, but in reality would certainly prevent any of that stuff from being real.
The human body might not be able to sustain powers like flight or laser vision, but there may be some enhancements it can sustain. As we were researching this episode, it became apparent that some superhuman abilities in comics and movies might be rooted in a little bit of truth. Super speed like the Flash, super strength like the Hulk, and unbreakable bones like Wolverine could all be possible through genetic variants.
Certainly there are specific variants that have been found, for example, with respect to musculature, that has been uncovered that people can develop an incredible degree of muscle tone and muscle strength, and that's related to genes, variants in genes that control how your muscles grow and develop. But again, that's not something we've come across, and in general, those are pretty rare. As we talked about earlier, typically when we think of genetics and it's often because you're sick with something and we want to figure out the genetic cause of it. Generally speaking, when you do, and I think the analogy here is that human beings are and life on Earth in general, it's complicated, right? So if you think about a human body, trillions of cells, and you have your liver and your brain and your heart and your kidneys and your skin, and they're all very, very different, and so it's very complicated. And mutations happen for, at least at first glance, they're basically random. So it's a little bit like saying, if I go into a car engine and I randomly pull a wire out, will the engine be better or worse? And the answer is, if it does have an effect, it's probably going to make the engine not work, right? If you just start randomly messing with things, pulling them out, putting an extra part in, et cetera, it's generally going to lead to the system not working quite right rather than the system working better. But it certainly is possible, and once in a while you might have unplugged something that actually, now you're getting 50 miles to the gallon or something, right? Those are very rare compared to the scenario where, now the engine doesn't turn on. Or the scenario where, which is in reality what happens is every single one of us, in fact, is born with lots of mutations that, and we're talking dozens or hundreds of changes in our DNA that we don't share with our mom or dad that are brand new. And for the most part, they don't do anything at all. So, there's very often the case that a genetic variant has no effect or has an effect that's so small that we can't observe it or measure it. And so, unfortunately, what that means is that genetics is often associated with sort of disease and worse outcomes rather than advantages. But once in a while, it certainly is true, and those stories are really fascinating.
This is a fascinating conversation with Dr. Cooper because to this point, we've talked about superpowers that are kind of larger than life, fantastical powers that none of us could really ever hope to have, like flying. But he's saying that there are certain abilities, superpowers, we can say, that someone could possess that are allow us to do things that are different or to go places that other people can't go, just of the, I guess you could say, general population.
There are indeed groups of people who have certain abilities that allow them to live places most of us couldn't or do activities that a lot of us are not capable of. For example, Sherpa populations live well above sea level at really low oxygen, and they thrive up there, whereas most of us would have to come down with altitude sickness. There are also nomadic people that live in the oceans who can dive really, really deep and stay underwater for like 15 to 20 minutes. I know I can't hold my breath for longer than like a minute, so that's extremely impressive.
A minute just alone is impressive, actually. And I've seen these nomadic people that you're talking about. They kind of live on boats and basically hop island to island. So that begs the question of the ability to hold your breath that long. Is that something that's just developed over the course of days and weeks of practice, or is that like generations of adaptation, or is that something on the genetic level? Like, where does that actually start? Because in the comic books, it's usually something that happens, instantaneously. But I'm assuming that doesn't actually happen instantaneously.
So we're going to talk about this a little deeper with Dr. Cooper, but to set us up, there are different flavors of change. So there's adaptation on an individual level, where you are adapting to your environment so that you can survive. And those are mostly physiological changes or even like mental changes that happen so that you can thrive and survive in your environment. Then, as we've been talking about this episode, there are genetic variants that you're born with that your parents don't have that give you some type of advantage. Then one step further, there are genetic changes that happen in an individual that give them an adaptation that allows them to survive. Then they pass that on to their offspring, who then survive and pass on the gene. And many, many generations later, you have a genetic change that has been introduced in a population.
Genetic change to the extent of making two groups of people or two species different from one another happens very slowly over the course of hundreds of thousands, millions of years. So if you're talking about something that, this group has been living in some area for the last 25 years, that's not going to be a genetic phenomenon, right? That there's not nearly enough time for meaningful genetic changes to have occurred that separate those groups. Whereas if you go back to compare, say, humans and Neanderthals, yes, there is some genetic differences that almost surely matter to the appearance and activity of humans versus Neanderthals. And certainly if you go over the course of billions of years, all life basically arose through this process of mutation and selection. And so this amazing diversity of life that we see is this product. It just doesn't happen over the course of tens or hundreds or even thousands of years. It's much, much larger time frames than that. Now, there have been examples of genetic changes that do appear to have arisen somewhat recently, and again, we would say recently in the tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of years, that change certain attributes like your ability to digest lactose, right? That's one of the examples that people have pointed to, but there aren't a lot of those stories, and it's just because that kind of change takes place very slowly over evolutionary time and not quickly.
If you were to have one of these traits that would allow you to have a superpower that is not constrained by the laws of physics, what would that be?
I guess I haven't thought about that too much. Flight is always one that would be pretty amazing, right? So I guess the simple answer is being able to fly would be pretty remarkable. And also, I think you could minimize the downsides of that one, if you will. Because another thing might be like Charles Xavier, right? You have the ability to hear people's thoughts, but that I feel like that would have a dark side to it too, right? If you were constantly bombarded with other people's internal thoughts. But yeah, so to me, flight's probably the simplest. Like, yeah, that one would be a lot of fun, and I don't know that there'd be a lot of downside to that. If you could control when and how you could fly, it would just be. Plus, not being able to wait in traffic would be pretty great.
Yeah.
I'm sorry to press you on this, but I feel like the people will need to know this.
Okay.
If you were right now able to go outside and fly, would you wear a parachute as a backup?
I guess I'd start small and figure out if I needed it, right? You'd float up 3 or 4 feet, so you'd do some experiments to figure out what could be done safely. Yeah, I don't know. That's a great question.
Yeah, I mean, if I don't fully understand the mechanics of how this works, I might still wear a parachute just in case, because who knows if the power is going to be pulled at some point, you know?
It's a great point. If you have no idea what the mechanism is, that's absolutely a fair point. Yeah, you'd like to know a little bit about that. I never thought about that, but that's a great point.
Over the past 2 episodes, we spent a lot of time talking about superpowers, what is possible, what's not possible, and Sarah, I feel like we just need to take a little bit of time, stop this conversation, digest, think about what we would actually want to have as our own superpower. But next episode, let's move on to something different. Like, where are we going for the next episode?
For the next episode, we're going to dive into the world of genetic engineering and pop culture.
Genetic engineering. So are we talking cloning, something like that?
Absolutely, cloning, but also a little bit of gene editing, the use of CRISPR.
Excellent. New territory. I'm looking forward to that.
Tiny Expeditions is a podcast about genetics, DNA, and inheritance from the HudsonAlpha Institute for Biotechnology. We're a nonprofit research institution in Huntsville, Alabama, with a unique mission.
We bring together scientists and companies to develop and apply genomic advances to make a better world. That's everything from cancer research to agriculture for a changing climate.
If you enjoyed this episode, swing by your favorite podcast app and hit that subscribe button. While you're there, consider leaving us a review. It really helps us spread the knowledge.
Thanks for joining.